A very warm welcome to the 21st edition of the World Sustainable Development Summit, being held virtually under the broad theme of Towards a Resilient Planet, Ensuring a Sustainable and Equitable Future. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the thematic track titled Endocrine-Disrupting Chemicals, EDCs, Regulatory and Policy Implications for India. I am Vidhu Kapoor, your MC for the session. The research and discourse of endocrine-disrupting chemicals and their human exposure have gained traction in recent years, given the immense scientific evidence of EDCs adversely impacting human health and financial implications of inaction. Stringent regulations and management are critical. Without further ado, I request Dr. Sarkar, Senior Director, Natural Resource Climate TERI, to deliver welcome address. With a doctorate in economics, he is an IS officer, retired. Sir has served several positions in government, including former secretary to the Government of India in the Ministry of Water Resources. Dr. Sarkar has several publications, authored, edited books, and presented at several conferences. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to all the panelists, experts, participants of today's thematic track event. It has been a privilege for me to be involved with this Indo-Norwegian study, endocrine disruptors in Indian food, minimizing children exposure and fostering a safer space for agriculture and food market, EDIFY, which has been supported by Research Council of Norway, implemented by NIBIO from Norway, Rekitox from Czech Republic, TERI, Mugama Consultants, Toxic Links, and SRM Institute of Science and Technology, Bharatland. This study and many other recent studies have raised concerns about the wide range of consequences of endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs, owing to an increase in adverse health impacts on human and wildlife. The impact of EDCs on human health, such as cancer, diabetes, thyroid disruption, neurological disorders, obesity, have been well documented internationally. Extensive research underlines that India is a hotspot for EDCs, and some of the findings of this study are indeed eye-opening. The EDIFY project is the first comprehensive study to systematically provide comprehensive data on levels of various significant dashes of EDCs in the Indian food basket, evaluating dietary intakes of EDCs such as persistent organic pollutants, POPs, current use of pesticides, heavy metals, and plasticizers. It has done detailed analysis of cereals, pulses, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, fish, poultry products, drinking water from Delhi, and peri-urban areas of Dehradun, a control site. A total of 130 samples were analyzed for 112 types for EDCs. I am glad that this study has unfolded many aspects of contamination in the Indian food basket. It has brought out a few recommendations for the policymakers of the country. India has several legislation for chemical management, yet the regulations and policies that indirectly regulate EDC need to be strengthened. Need for holistic planning and management of EDCs by integrating the key aspects of environmental sustainability and targets of sustainable development goals. Now let us hear from the panelists of today's sessions the findings of this study and how we in India can leverage and expand the existing measures to address the problem of EDC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for introducing the study. Bharat Learn has aptly captured the essence of the research under the EDIFY project and the actionable path that the scientists aim to convey to policymakers. We now screen the documentary, EDCs in Indian Foods, Findings and Recommendations.
Inside our bodies, there is a network of glands and organs called endocrine system that secrete hormones, which are essential for our growth and development. Mimicking the shape of these hormones, dangerous chemicals called EDCs or endocrine-disrupting chemicals enter our bodies and fit into cellular receptors and create havoc in our endocrine system. They develop serious developmental, reproductive, neurological, and immune effects in both humans and animals. EDCs can enter our bodies through air we breathe, food we eat, water we drink, and through the skin. EDCs also transfer from mother to fetuses and infants. We are a group of researchers and scientists from Norway, Czech Republic, and Indian institutions working towards the common goal of bringing out comprehensive information regarding all EDC groups in the representative Indian food basket. Samples were collected from different zones of urban Delhi as well as peri-urban areas of Dehradun in order to form a representative data for the Indian subcontinent. Through research, we have quantified them for an extensive list of chemical compounds. Pesticides are used to improve agricultural yield and extend the shelf time of food. There is, however, a concern that their residues in food and water can be harmful for the health of the end user.
In our research, chlorpyrifos and chlorpyrifos were frequently detected in several food products, especially in potato and cereals.
Food production and preservation practices are linked to high pesticide residues in food in India.
Heavy metals contamination in food from the soil or irrigation water can cause both acute and chronic EDC-like health effects.
Carcinogenic risk due to nickel and arsenic in the diet was higher than the threshold for all the food items, the highest being in milk and spinach.
Majority vegetables had concentrations of lead and cadmium higher than the permissible limits, whereas pulses had higher nickel content.
Plastic is commonly used in food packaging to provide flexibility in packaging and durability of the product. Many of these plasticizers are in fact powerful EDCs and can contaminate food when they come in contact with it.
Phthalic acid esters were high in industrially packaged cottage cheese and fish. Bisphenol A was high in potatoes and fish.
Packaging material was identified as a source of the plasticizer di-N-butyl phthalate (DNBP) in the packaged food.
Suspected carcinogenic phthalates are found to be very high in dairy products in Delhi, especially cottage cheese, that's paneer.
Beyond these groups of substances, we also analyzed residues of well-known persistent organic pollutants such as DDT, PCB, linden and dioxin in the Indian diet, causing health concern.
Well, the good news is we found that the rural population diet provides a substantially lower amount of many of the measured EDCs. This is both due to the dietary habits and the generally lower level of EDCs found in local and traditionally produced food, compared to the food products entering mainstream distribution, especially in the urban areas.
Children and pregnant women are at very high risk of exposure to heavy metal plasticizers. Regulators should carefully consider dietary recommendations to reduce EDC intake, especially tailored to women in childbearing age in Indian urban contexts. Adopt a routine national monitoring plan to track occurrence and temporal trends of EDCs in food and to early identification of contamination hotspots. Incentivize the food industry to introduce a trusted quality labeling system for EDCs to guide consumers towards health-preserving choices and to steer toward food excellence in India. Update the food safety and standards regulations based on global benchmarks. India stands at the cusp to recognize the dangers of EDCs and make necessary changes in its food regulation policies to protect its large population from its harmful effects. The time for action is now, because the cost of not taking an action is very high. Thank you.
May I now request Dr. Andrea Tiron, Senior Scientific Officer, Pesticide Peer Review Unit, European Food Safety Authority, to deliver the special address. Dr. Andrea Tiron is Senior Toxicologist and Pathologist with an educational background in veterinary medicine and toxicology. He has held several lead positions in toxicology. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair, and thank you for the invitation. My name is indeed Andrea Terron. I'm a Senior Scientific Officer at the Pesticide Peer Review Unit at the European Food Safety Authority. And what I'm going to tell you today is quickly tackling how in Europe we provide identification of pesticide having endocrine disrupting properties. So I will specify that this is the approach that we are taking in Europe and the activity that we are taking in Europe. This first slide is indeed to foster the relevance of the endocrine disruption theme. This particularly is referencing to the thyroid hormone system disruption, where on the left side in particular, you see the many sites where a chemical can interact with the thyroid hormone system. You can see some of these interaction also on the right side, but what is important for you is to realize that all these sites of action culminate on the most sensitive target, which is the developing brain. So we are talking about a process that goes to the bench, experimental level, evidence from the experimental conduction to the society implication. And the society implication is quite dramatic because effect on the developing brain are as a consequence a drop in the IQ or the occurrence of very important brain liability, particularly in the newborn and in the youth, like autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. But what is an endocrine disruptor? You can find many definitions of endocrine disruption. As a toxicologist, for me, an endocrine disruption is just an endocrine toxicant. But in Europe, under the legislative umbrella, the definition of the endocrine disruption is the one as defined by the legislative criteria. So basically, a substance to be classified as an endocrine disruptor should be adverse, so must show an adverse effect, must show an endocrine activity, and we need to demonstrate that there is a biologically plausible link between the adverse effect and the endocrine activity. So basically, the adverse effect is the consequence of the endocrine activity. Indeed, these criteria are described and laid down in the Commission Delegated Regulation. And the Commission Delegated Regulation exists in Europe for the biocidal product and for the plant protection product, the pesticide. What is very important for you to note that the legislature considers the ED criteria as cut-off. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that they are hazard-based, so you don't have to do a risk assessment, but when the hazard is identified and you are able to provide this link between the hazard and the endocrine activity, this is expected to prevent the approval of an active substance, unless negligible exposure is demonstrated, but these are not risk assessor, but risk manager provision. After the effort of the legislative effort of the European Parliament, the European Food Safety Authority and the European Chemical Agency were mandated to provide a technical guidance for the implementation of the criteria, particularly in the context of the biocide and pesticide regulation. And indeed, in 2018, ECHA and EFSA publish the guidance for the identification of endocrine disruptor in the context of the respective regulation. So the guidance is a short and crispy document, but in this slide, I really like to summarize on which kind of documentation the assessment strategy is based. And the reference documentation is the OECD Guidance 150, where the evidence collected in the data set for any active substance are integrated along 4 pillars. So the pillar number 1, number 2 are expected to provide information on endocrine activity. The pillar number 3 and number 4 are expected to provide information on the adversity. So the job is to establish if there is a plausible link between the two using a mode of action or an adverse outcome pathway framework as a matter of work activity. So where we are. Since 2018, EFSA has conducted a little bit more than 90 assessments for the identification of pesticide having ED properties, and this is now a routine job that we do basically on routine at routine level. In this slide, I present you a summary of the work done so far. I mean, on the right side, you can see that our job, as well as the guidance, is very much focused on few endocrine modality: estrogen modality, androgen modality, steroidogenesis modality, and thyroid modality. And you can see that for most of the endocrine active substance, so the so-called endocrine disrupting chemicals, the winner is the thyroid modality. But on the left side, you have the broad picture. So you can see that among these 90, actually there are already 94 substances. Additional data have been required for 36 substances, for 23 based on chemical physical properties or exposure properties or specific toxicological properties. An endocrine disruption assessment was waived. For 29%, we can conclude that there are no ED, but for 12%, we conclude that they are ED. This is my final slide because I was really happy to see the question that you pose in the background document. So what are the most critical data gaps and research needs that continue to exacerbate and resolve issues on endocrine disrupting chemicals? Well, the experience we have done so far is undoubtedly focused on regulatory action dealing with estrogen, androgen, thyroid and steroidogenesis modality. And in Europe, we have several projects that aim to identify most sensitive endpoint, and because this is still a data gap, particularly for the thyroid hormone system, where the most sensitive target organ is the developing brain. Is very difficult to have a suitable model describing the consequences of perturbing the thyroid hormone system when using animal models. So the likelihood is that you have to go to more mechanistic information to protect in a more suitable way. The second point that is very important is that we know that at least for mammals and human in the specific, we have more than 40 endocrine mediated pathway for which we have no established tool to be used in the regulatory risk assessment. So for any chemical that will act outside the so-called its modality, it will be always very complicated for us to conclude and apply hazard-based cutoff criteria. So on top of this, I have to say that the similar activity and similar approach is also ongoing, has been taken for the ecotox system. So the criteria are basically the same and they apply to the mammalian as well to the ecotox system. I think this is my last slide, and happy to take any question at the end or whenever is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for an insightful presentation. May I now request Ms. Roli Singh, IAS Additional Secretary, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, to deliver the keynote address. Ms. Singh is from Rajasthan cadre 1994 batch. Prior to her appointment as Additional Secretary, ma'am has served as Principal Secretary to Government Department of Personnel, Rajasthan, Jaipur. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vidhu. Thank you, Dr. Sarkar, for having me here for this very important discussion on endocrine disrupting chemicals, regulatory and policy implications for India. Just to introduce myself, I'm currently Additional Secretary in the Ministry of Health, and FSSAI is one of the regulatory arms that works under the AGs of Ministry of Health, Government of India, apart from the Drug Regulatory Authority. So with that background, I would just like to share a presentation and at the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Andrea Teron for giving such a in-depth technical insight into the subject from the European Union standards. And this is indeed, the findings of this workshop are indeed going to be very enlightening for all of us. So, I mean, moving on, I would just like to give a quick background of the Food Safety and Standards Authority that is operating as on date. The mandate is to ensure safe and wholesome food, and it is under, and all the regulations that are made under it basically take care of that aspect. It sets compliable limits for various safety parameters, including contaminants, residues, naturally occurring toxins, all the microbial characteristics as part of its horizontal standards that cut across all food categories. It also takes into account the agricultural practices, food chain interventions, and geographical variations in occurrences of both biological and chemical contaminants. You are all aware of this. You people are technical experts, so these are not things that are new to you. And this is just by way of setting the tone of the discussion as from the government perspective. So the aspects that have been well established and that have a negative impact on food safety and health are addressed either by reviewing the standards or setting up new limits in case emerging risks or threats to food safety are detected. So as, I mean, I don't need to explain this, you are experts here. We know that endocrine disruptors mean substances that alter functions of the endocrine system. They mess around with our hormonal balance and they cause adverse health effects and an intact physiological system, which Dr. Teron explained so beautifully. And they vary from chemicals, contaminants, pesticides, persistent organic pollutants, and few anti-nutritional factors which are present in food. So I would like to just tell you where we stand currently in terms of the regulatory setup that we have in India. There is a long way to go. The background paper has amply pointed that out, that there is a lot that needs to be done, and we are still struggling with data and evidence to base our policy on. So we have laid down evidence-based standards and set limits for various contaminants, residues, as I mentioned earlier, but this is only for processed and packaged foods and ingredients used for preparation in such processed commodities. And as pointed out right now, there is a risk-based model and there is a hazard-based model. The US Environment Protection Agency regulates on a risk-based kind of a strategy, whereas we saw that the European Commission has a hazard-based approach, which I think is of a lower tolerance for any of these chemicals from entering into the food chain, especially which are used for human consumption. And we see the Japanese Ministry of Environment Protection has about 67 suspected endocrine disruptors that are listed on the basis again of a risk-based kind of assessment, but also maybe the hazard-based element is also there because they're also very stringent. But to a very limited extent, they are indirectly regulated under other laws related to either agriculture, animal, or environmental health. So the challenges before us that we see in India are, it can't be regulated under only a category of contaminants or residues. It requires concerted efforts. It requires a collaborative platform. Like we saw that there was a joint advisory that had been issued which Mr. Teron shared, it was both from the European, I think the chemical regulator agency as well as the food regulatory agency. So something of that kind probably needs to be done, where we have joint guidelines where both the where regulators across ministries and departments come together. India has sought help from Codex also to develop guidelines for determination of pesticides as endocrine disruptors and frame a harmonized risk management approach to assess what is the presence in food. So we are very grateful that this study has been undertaken by EDIFY under this EDIFY project, and I'm sure the findings here will go a long way in assisting the government in coming up with something concrete. So as you know, uniform guidelines are a huge challenge, and we need to have an approach which is internationally harmonized and which takes care of trade as well as our public health issues. Then, of course, data is an issue. I'm hoping that studies like this will feed into it, and we would require a more, a more organic kind of an interface with organizations like TERI. We need to develop more platforms where we can have this kind of an exchange, and we can actually make it a more organic and a more integrated approach, because research happening on its own will not have much traction unless the ministries are also on board, especially the ministries of Environment and Forest and the Ministry of Agriculture. So we need appropriate for an actual evidence-based and risk associated with EDs kind of a formula for policy. We need to have appropriate testing, surveillance mechanisms, and mechanisms to create such databases. So the future roadmap, as has already been pointed out, is for testing, identifying, monitoring the sources. Source is important because the food safety standards are not really looking at the sources. They really don't have the the depth to get into what the Agriculture Ministry should be doing at that stage. Then evaluation of levels of exposure and possible impact of such exposures, then establishing the risk analysis framework based on the sources, exposure and impact, and minimizing exposure to EDs if found hazardous basis the exposure through risk mitigation measures. So it has to be a collaborating platform between different ministries as I see it: agriculture, fisheries, dairies, food processing, pharmaceuticals, and then we also have to see in how we plug in with the international food regulatory mechanisms or systems that are already there. And obviously technology will have to be leveraged in a big way. How do we use and how do we create partnerships with bodies like EU and US, which are already using these tools for identifying or certifying the commodities which are hazardous. So we would look forward for towards the research and academia to develop and provide a mechanism for collecting scientific evidences, which I'm sure studies like these have already started doing. Maybe we need to broad base it across other products and other potential sources of contamination, maybe dairy, and see where, because dairy is another thing which is consumed right from childhood, and it has a huge impact on, I think, pregnant women as well as children who are already, the small children who are exposed to dairy products outside. And it is also important that industry and research bodies help the concerned ministries to ascertain the impact of the EDs on the environment and help us set up surveillance frameworks and creating awareness. And as has already been mentioned in the background note, and you're aware that there is a publication of draft chemical management and safety rules under the Environment Protection Act 1986. And we hope that it will take care at least of some aspects of, regulating. It does mention the endocrinal disruptors. So we hope that this will take care of some of it, but not entirely. And we are aware that we have all signed the Stockholm Convention, so we are committed to the policies and the outcomes that have been, or the goals that have been set in that convention. And as a follow-up to the convention, there was a development of a national implementation plan in 2011 by Ministry of Environment and Forest. And again, it had broad objectives to implement the objectives and to create awareness, but I think more concerted work needs to be done in this area. So I'm hoping from this work, from this seminar today, that we will be given some concrete way forwards from the experts who are speaking on the subject, and we will be then engaging more meaningfully with organizations like TERI across ministries, and maybe some mechanism needs to be created for actually moving ahead in this direction. So I would like to thank you once again for having me over, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion and learning from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your remarks and suggesting future direction. May I request all the distinguished speakers to join in the release of policy brief on endocrine disrupting chemicals in food and drinking water in India, state of affairs, and recommendations for policy maker. The policy brief is an outcome of the study. Moving on to our second part of the session, we have with us a great lineup of speakers to share with us the learning from the study. I would now hand over to Dr. Girija Bharat to moderate the session. Dr. Bharat is founder director of Mugama Consultants Private Limited, Gurgaon. She is an international expert with more than 30 years of experience in water quality, environmental chemical pollution control, and environmental management, among others. She leads several international projects and has several publications and awards to her credit. Over to you, Dr. Girija.
Thank you, Vidhu, for the kind introduction. Indeed, an honor to be part of WSDS 2022, and really glad to have Rolly Singh ma'am for giving the special address. Also, Dr. Andrea Teron and other distinguished experts in this program. And more importantly, the study on EDCs that Dr. Luca and I had conceptualized way back in 2016, which started in 2018. And here we are with all the distinguished scientists with the findings recommendations for policy uptake. Well, pandemic or no pandemic, we work together as a close-knit team, working across different time zones, different geographical boundaries with resilience, zest, passion, and purpose. We have a distinguished panel with Mr. Satish Sinha from Toxics Link, Dr. Luca Nizito from NIVA, Dr. Paramita from SRM Institute of Science and Technology, Dr. Mohan Sharma from Resetox. Thanks for giving this opportunity to me, Vidhu, and the entire team for introducing the distinguished panel. Mr. Satish Sinha is the Associate Director of Toxics Link and has been involved with research-based policy advocacy on environmental issues, especially on hazardous and medical waste management, food safety, chemicals, persistent organic pollutants, EDCs. He has worked extensively on policy and legal aspects of bisphenol A, lead in paints, e-waste, etc., to name a few. May I now request Mr. Sinha to take over and share his insights. Over to you, Mr. Sinha. Thank you.
Thank you, Girijaji. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. And thank you to the organizers for including EDC in the summit this year, 2022. And also thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on EDCs. Synthetic chemicals have become an integral part of modern lifestyle, actually. These chemicals are available in everyday products that we see around us. It could be toys, clothes, furniture, automobile, electronic gadgets, and even the food that we consume is laced with chemicals. We find residues of chemicals in everything. Many of these chemicals are highly toxic, and the world has come to recognize a new group of chemicals which disrupt the endocrine function, and they are known as endocrine-disrupting substances, as has been mentioned by Teron. These are known, in short, we call them EDCs, and this is what EDC does. It is linked to serious reproductive and neurological disorders, both in humans and animals. And they cause disease, as mentioned, like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, kidney disorders, infertility in both male and female. So these are some of the diseases that are caused by EDC. Children and newborn are exceptionally or especially vulnerable to EDCs. And I think that has to be borne in mind when we are talking about EDCs and the remedial actions or policy decisions that we look at. How do we protect children and newborn? That is very, very important. EDC as a group was first acknowledged by the Endocrine Society in 2009. And they published a report which linked these chemicals to altering the endocrine functions in humans. The same report also mentions the human health cost to about 157 billion euros per annum for EU alone. So that's the cost that we're talking about just for Europe. It is about 157 billion euros in the cost of health cost for dealing with this disease. You can imagine what would be the quantum of money or resources required in a country like ours for a population that we have. In year 2012, WHO, IPEN, and ILO released another report, and they flagged up this issue about EDC and health concerns and asked for global action on this. In the same year, even the SciChem, which is a body, which also asked for global action and asked nation states to protect their citizens against the impact of EDCs and take actions which is nationally relevant to each nation. That's because SciChem is a voluntary organization, and that's why there can't be a legally binding instrument to deal with EDCs. So that was a call from SciChem in 2012 again. Several research studies have identified and established some of these commonly known chemicals that we see in everyday product like bisphenol A, triclosan, phthalates, nonylphenols, chlorinated pesticides, and some of the POPs or persistent organic pollutants, and also some of the heavy metals, which are now recognized as EDCs, and perhaps we could have more of such EDCs. These are extensively used in many of these products, and most of us are continuously being exposed to these chemicals. Unknowingly, perhaps, many of us don't know if you're being exposed or we are not being exposed. The larger implication is also that many of these chemicals do not remain in the products itself. They find or they leach into the larger environment. And some of it impacts the food chain. It goes into the food chain. So there is a larger connect between many of these chemicals and its impact on food chain that we are discussing today. So if you don't handle many of these products rightly, or if there is a problem in dealing with some of these products, it will find itself out into larger environment and into the food chain. So in India too, it was ToxicLink which started, my organization started work on EDCs in the year 2012-13, as soon as it came up in SciChem, because we are part of the SciChem, this thing. So we started working in 2012-13, and we released our first report in 2014, and we published a report on EDCs. Some of the and subsequently other reports, but one of the some of the important reports that was published by ToxicLink was presence of BPA in bisphenol A in sippy cups and baby feeding bottles. This was one of the important reports that we released in 2014, followed by other kinds of reports like presence of phthalates in diapers, nonylphenols in detergents, triclosan in hand wash. And now we are compiling this detailed report on EDCs in food and its impact on food chain. This initial work of ToxicLink helped bring many of these institutions and other players who are working on EDCs to come together and start researching. And some of our current partners that we see today are here, which is NIVA, SRM, Mugama, JNU. And we also had another partner, which I would like to mention, is in a National Institute of Reproductive Health, which is based in Bombay. They have been working on this issue for a long, long time. And some of their reports are very interesting, where they very clearly link EDCs to reproductive health in National Institute of Reproductive Health. And they find that some of the effects are intergenerational. So it passes from one generation to another generation. This is the larger impact of EDCs on reproductive health. And also loss of fertility was another thing that National Institute of Reproductive Health has been pointing out because of EDC. So these are the larger impacts of this. While the conversation continues to be in initial stages in India and research is still on, and we're trying to get more data and understanding of the subject, but it's important to point out that the government of India has placed or taken some steps which are very, very encouraging, and I would like to mention some of them. It was in 2015 and subsequently in 2020 that government banned the use of bisphenol A in baby feeding bottles and sippy cups. The Ministry of Women and Child Development issued this letter, and then it was subsequently banned in 2015 and 20. Another notification has been BPA has been phased out from infant food packaging. So when you package infant food, you can't use BPA as packaging material in it. So that was another very interesting development from the Indian government side in 2020. They have also banned the use of phthalates in toys in 2020. These are all policy decisions which have been taken. And the last one that I'd like to mention, as it has been mentioned by the Joint Secretary, it has been the recognition of EDC as a chemical in the draft chemical rules. I think that's a very, very significant development that I like to mention, that it is being recognized by Government of India as a chemical of concern. And that is what it triggers action from here. If you put it in the rules, it triggers a lot of action. Now, what are those? That's a different thing to see. How does it work? And as a nation, these are some small steps that we have taken, but there are huge challenges for EDCs for a country of our nature and a population that we have about 1.35 or 1.4 billion population. Some of these I'd like to very quickly mention in points or bullet points. I think there is need for more data and research on EDC. There are very few organizations which are working on it, and much more level of cooperation between North and South and other institutions is required in this to get more data. There are very few organizations that work, and we have been working with many of these things. And as such, there's a requirement of many more national institutions also. There are a lot of research institutions that need to come together and work on this. I think another point is about the participation of industry. It is very critical because industry is the major user of these chemicals. How do we get them on board? We need to understand that they will have to find substitutes for many of these chemicals. And if they don't come on board, if there is a reluctance, it will be very difficult to find answers for many of these. We also need to invest and ask industry or encourage industry to invest in global best practices and look at supply chains which maintain the integrity and don't have many of these things. The third thing that I like to mention is about engaged public discourse on this, public information awareness and public information awareness and advisories for people who are in vulnerable groups. That is very, very important. And another important thing that I would like to point out is about when you make products, the amount of the level, the kind of leveling that we put in these products, that creates public information. It puts out this kind of advisories to people and informs them how to use products. So these are some things that we need to do as we move forward and to deal with some of these issues of EDCs. The last point that I like to mention that as a policy matter, that India today is moving forward and adopting a concept or philosophy of circular economy. And I think Niti Aayog has already moved forward in that. And we see a lot of discussions happening, and many other sectors that Niti Aayog is working with is adopting this circular economy approach. These contaminants in material chains are likely to create serious bottlenecks when you're talking about circular economy. And I think that needs to be factored in, that we should not be looking at circularity when you have toxins involved in it. We need to decouple both these things. This is an important lesson that we should take home and put it in the policy framework. We need to look for solutions to protect citizens from the adverse impacts of EDCs. And I can only say that the cost of inaction can be very, very high. So we need to act as soon as possible. So thank you all. That's all that I have to say. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to take.
Thank you, Sateshji. That was very, very insightful and very interesting. I'm sure Dr. Sarkar and Dr. Surali Singh would really find it very insightful to take many actions. Well, EDIFY project has had lots of elements, scientists, policymakers, advocacy experts, and so on. So we now have Dr. Luca Nizetto, who is a senior research scientist from Norwegian Institute of Water Research, Oslo. He has rich expertise in analysis of drivers, sources, fate, distribution, and impacts of chemical contaminants and microplastics in the environment. He runs several international research projects on different areas, including terrestrial, freshwater and marine pollution, microplastics in agriculture, and freshwater systems. May I invite Dr. Luca to take the floor. Over to you, Luca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Girija. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge my happiness of being here, closing this project, and to state my satisfaction of being able to collaborate with this group of people. So thank you also, Srimati Singh, for your contribution, very appreciated. Thank you, Dr. Teron, for this very important contribution from the European perspective. There are lessons to be learned, I believe. Dear panelists, colleagues, esteemed audience and friends, research on environmental contamination shows that India might be a hotspot of endocrine disrupting chemicals. As we heard, this group of chemical contaminants can produce adverse effects following chronic exposure, even at very low concentrations, especially, as we just mentioned, when this exposure occurs in a very early stage of development. Several EDCs can be transmitted from mother to child during pregnancies and lactation. Because of this subtle mode of toxic action and exposure and toxic action, establishing a nexus between EDC exposure and epidemiological outcomes has been a great challenge, and it still is, especially in a context of multi-stress. Despite this challenge, EDC are now centralizing scientific, societal, and policy debates. And recently, advanced chemical management system and food safety regulation started acknowledging new approaches on how to identify, prioritize substances that has a character or a potential character as an endocrine disruptor. It is unfortunately necessary to acknowledge that these uncertainties and the historical lack of ability for an early classification of a new substance as an EDC, of course, cause delays in taking concrete action from both the regulatory perspective, but also from the industrial perspective. The scientific community, of course, and many environmental organizations internationally has advocated for a precautionary approach, really to deal with this background of uncertainty and lack of capacity. And this started being incorporated in regulatory in policies and in regulatory documents. To this regard, the Endocrine Society has been mentioned here before, which is the community, academic community of reference with the context of endocrine disruptors, has clearly stated their position, urging a regulator internationally to take action by adopting precautionary principles. This happened during the last decade, basically. This big momentum has arisen during the last decade. In some cases, we know there are endocrine disruptors that are known and have been around for several decades. So, which means that the delays in managing this problem may sort of result in entire generations being exposed and maybe suffering the sort of impact that we have listed before. So considering the need and the ongoing effort to endow India with a more holistic chemical management system, and taking note of the scarcity of data on the dietary exposure for several priority contaminants, including some that are already recognized as endocrine disruptor, we conceived this international research project that is called EDIFY, Endocrine Disruptor in Indian Food. Is a project that tackle the problem from the point of view of exposure. There is a lack of systematic data on the presence of endocrine disruptor in food. Diet is the main pathway of several of these substances to the general population. So we felt like to support the effort of India by providing a comprehensive pilot to show what is the current state of the art in terms of exposure, to try to identify some pattern of exposure across, for example, different group of people. And this is all described in the report that was launched today. Documentably, EDIFY, I believe, has been the first study conducted in India with this ambition. The project stems from an international collaboration between European and Indian institutes and was finalized to running an ambitious pilot study looking at a level of several compounds in the food basket of India, in both the urban food basket taken daily as a representative case study and the peri-urban area in the north of India to reflect more a condition for a more rural population. So if you allow me, I would like to share now some few slides. It's coming. Just give me 1 second. I hope you can see my slide.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. We design an ambitious monitoring plan, although it's not comparable to the European monitoring effort on residues in food. This is, but this is something we could do with within the frame of this research project that I recall is funded by the Research Council of Norway through an international cooperation scheme. So we choose Delhi as a reference site. We purchase food from different type of markets across different regions of the city. We choose Delhi because it's the most cosmopolitan city in India. People from all over India lives in Delhi, bringing their consumption habits, their dietary choice, their lifestyle. So we thought Delhi could be a good representative case study to gather information about all India. We also added, as I mentioned, this reference site, Dehradun, in the north, that represent a more rural scenario. In each location, we collected from street markets, but also supermarkets, a number of food items, including different types of drinking water, fruits, vegetables, pulses, cereals, dairy products, animal-based products. And we collect also information about average daily consumption for each typology in order to project dietary exposure scenarios for both the rural and the urban population that you can see is pretty different in India. So we conducted thorough, big effort, analytical effort in some of the best laboratory in India and in Europe to investigate, to measure the level of up to 112 substances recognized as EDC. This included several persistent organic pollutants like organochlorine pesticides, dioxins, furans, PCBs, and so on. We included a set of plasticizers. We will hear about this in the detail. We had some effort to monitor current use pesticide residues and some toxic metals. So the next talk, more detail will be provided for different group of these substances. So from this data on food contamination, we could project exposure assessment, and we identify interesting patterns. For example, for many group of substances, including most POPs and plasticizers, we notice substantial difference in the level of exposure between urban population and rural population, driven both by the quality of food, so the residues level in the food, but also driven by the different consumption habits. This is very interesting, something that maybe the policymaker could reflect to identify which resources exist in India to have better food choices. I want to share just a few results about the metals, and I thank Manish Jain for delivering this work, and it will be contained in the papers we are working on now. So we monitor several toxic metal in food. We calculated the exposure level. What we found is that all analyzed food, of course, contain residues of these metals. In some cases, unfortunately, level exceeded some international or national safety standard. For example, we compare with the data from FAO and WHO. Cadmium and lead were dominant across all food matrices. We noticed, for example, spinach, milk, and some cereals being important vector for the human exposure. You can read more about this in the report and in the papers that will come up. Finally, as reported in the report, we use this knowledge and this background. We also conducted policy analysis and comparative assessment between especially Europe and India regarding the development of policies on EDIFY. All this is part of the report, and the report includes 10 policy recommendations. I do not have time to go through all of them here. They are there, and I really hope policymaker, decision maker in India, and not only, could consider this message, which is delivered in an independent way and with a maximum level of scientific objectivity. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to reply to your question.
Thank you so much, Luca, and I'm sure this has been very insightful to all the participants and our other co-panelists and experts. I know Dr. Teran is keenly waiting for the policy recommendations and our papers, and we will be surely sharing it with everyone. And Rolly Singh ma'am, the policy recommendation and the policy brief will be shared with you soon. Thank you. I take this opportunity to also nudge the participants. If you have any questions, please post it in the chat box. We'll be happy to answer your queries, and would be very interesting discussion taking it forward. Now for the next speaker, may I request Dr. Paramita Chakravarti to take the floor, but before that, a brief introduction. She is an associate professor at Department of Chemical Engineering at SRM Institute of Science and Technology. She leads the Environmental Science and Technology Research Group that works on fate, transport, and cost-effective remediation techniques for legacy and emerging contaminants. She is leading several research projects and has published more than 70 research scientific publications, in addition to other technical and policy reports. Paramita, over to you, and thanks for being a great asset in the project. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Girija. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, fine. And thank you, Satishji and Luca, for setting the tone. And I'll be just briefing a very one segment of the project, which is on plastic additives in the Indian food basket. So in the next few slides, I will be taking you into the story of what we see in terms of the plastic additives or the plasticizers. So in the talk, I would include like what are the significance of these plastic additives. We'll try to just, a lot of students might be there. So just thought how we are seeing this plasticizers in the environment is also important. So coming down to our sampling design and the experimental setup and the research highlights, of course. So plastics, I actually, it was when I was listening to Satishji, it was, I was just thinking that, we first time when we start something in India in terms of EDCs, Toxics-Link is the organization who has a lot of data and a lot of information, and the real-time problems that they start with. Definitely Bisphenol A issue was a very, very interesting and important one. And I think we saw the impact of the challenges that Toxic-Link took up, that Satishji mentioned. We are seeing that in our results as well. So considering plastics are there everywhere. So if it is there, plastics are basically the polymers. We all know about it. But then where comes the plasticizer? Now this plasticizer or plastic additives are added to give flexibility or durability or softness to the plastic products. And in this matter, like a lot of plastic additives are used. Phthalates are one big category, and phthalic acid esters are few of those which are important. Why they are important, I'll come in next few slides. So these are some part of this phthalates which are used to give better structure to the plastic. My slides are not in full screen, but I can see it full screen. Okay, now how about it? Still not?
It's not shared now, I guess.
Can you see it full screen now? Many of the speakers have already mentioned about their functioning, how they mimic hormones and their actions are being noticed. So now considering these phthalates, there are high molecular weight orthophthalates, there are low molecular weight orthophthalates. The high molecular weight orthophthalates, they comprise nearly 70% of the plasticizer market, wherein this low molecular orthophthalates, they are bare minimum, like 5% of the market. But among this, the 6 phthalates which are considered as priority pollutants by United States Environmental Protection Agency, considering most of them as endocrine disruptors. So these are the ones which we targeted, along with many other phthalates apart from the 6 priority phthalates. Bisphenol A, which is again another intermediate, which is added, a plastic additive, and it is also an endocrine disruptor. And we also analyzed bisphenol A in our samples. Now the sources, like mostly it is used in polycarbonates or epoxy resins in the most of the products, those kind of polymeric material. Now, this is one important storyline, like plastics which are ending in the riverine environment. This very important paper which talks about like the plastics are getting mostly, and the Ganges is one of the important river which is mostly loaded with plastics, among the highest amount of plastic loading across the world. So out of the 20 main rivers, Ganges was one. Now, what were we doing? Like how we wanted to see like how the environment is getting contaminated with plastics. The one important reason is like the improper management of the plastic waste. The plastic waste which are dumped along the riverine belt or open burning is one important source. There are several papers, not only in most of the Asian countries, they have come up with lot of research work wherein we have seen that open burning leads to a lot of toxicants, including a good quantity of plasticizers. We have seen this open burning, how it leads to a release of some of the plasticizers in the atmosphere. We have seen that. And in the Ganges, as I was mentioning, why suddenly that slide now you will be able to connect, we have monitored such plastic additives along the entire stretch of Ganges and Sundarban wetland. And we have seen that there is a good correlation of certain compounds, especially di-n-butyl phthalate, with the plastic litter in the tourist spots. So that one of the main important finding of the work we see that this is there in the plastic bottles, maybe when we are discarding the plastic bottles in those tourist locations. And also this open dumps, we have, prior to our food study, we have seen in New Delhi that the open dumps or in the informal e-waste recycling sectors, they're also, because when they're taking out the precious metals, they're removing the cables, and a lot of plasticizers are being released in the soil. So water, soil, air, if all those are contaminated, its contamination mostly can be linked with the plasticizers coming from the plastic waste. So a lot of contaminants that are used in the plastic, including flame retardants or many other products that are getting released actually in the environment in different matrices. So that is a matter of concern. Now what happens, like if it is there in the environment, so if the environment is contaminated, then also there is an indirect pathway that we can possibly predict that it would be there in the food products. Not only that, this another important part of the plastic is the packaging. So packaging also makes an important role, because a lot of food products are being packaged in the plastic packaging, and then it is being sold off. So of course a lot of rules and regulations are being taken. So what mostly we have seen is like, for say for example for film applications, the plasticizers are used. What is the quantity? It is nearly 10% by the weight of the polymer. And also various studies have seen that the non-PVC packaging can also be source of phthalates. It's not necessarily has to be PVC packaging. Diet, as Dr. Luca rightly mentioned, that it's the major pathway for humans. So that was why we did this study. So what we basically did, actually Dr. Luca already mentioned about it. I will just add a few more points that we added for plastic products in particular, that apart from taking the local market and supermarket food products, what we also did is we made a composite sample of that. We also took individual locally available fish or milk or some other important food products. Why? Because we wanted to understand, we wanted to distinguish between those which are there within the plastic packaging and the ones that which are not at all been, having any plastic packaging. So to differentiate that, we had some few added samples and we also considered the tap water and the composite package water samples from different brands. We have done a very extensive analysis in our lab for all the compounds that we have, and we have specific methods for each of these, and with a proper, very proper quality assurance, quality control, including a lot of recovery isotope level standards. So for the packaging material also, we analyze those packaging material as well, like for example, the paneer packaging material and the wheat packaging material, so that we understand what could be an important compound which we can see in whether it is there in the packaging material or not. And we have analyzed those as well for all the targeted, we have analyzed 13 phthalic acid esters, including 6 priority phthalates, and also bisphenol A. Then what we did, what the data we got, we have assessed the human exposure, the dietary exposure, and dietary exposure, it is a factor that have done is the estrogenic potential using one of our biota assay, cell line assay, and another is an yeast assay. So this study is published by Cespedes et al., which we have used to check the estrogenic potential for the water samples. That because for food, it is like different variety. So we have our own assay results for water samples. So what did we see in the results in the platter? One important part that we saw was like definitely Delhi was having much higher concentration of all the plastic additives that we have seen over Dehradun. But the levels that we are seeing are much lesser compared to many levels reported across the globe. And this is again another thing that bisphenol A levels were lower in most of the food products, except for a high level in potato. This again, we might say that there was the strict banning in different areas, or the efforts taken by Toxic Link, we feel like could be one reason, because this is a much later study than what we saw earlier in the earlier reports.
Excuse me.
Supply. Yeah, hello.
Yeah, Paramita, your slide is not moving. We are still on slide 5.
Slide is not moving, but
yeah. Now it has come to 23.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know why, but okay, it's fine. So what we were seeing is like in the supply water, we saw that the phthalates were highest from the waste zone of Delhi. And DHP was very high in the local brands. Now, when we were seeing high DHP in the local brands, what we did a parallel study in the project where we have collected different brands of water, and we have done a model work exposing the water bottles at different temperatures, and then seeing whether there is leaching of this phthalates into this water. And what we saw was like the one that the recycled PET bottles, those were actually having slightly higher levels of phthalic acid esters. And then we could relate that we also saw the similar pattern, like when we are taking the local brands, maybe the local brand water bottles are made up of recycled PET bottles, which could be a reason for leaching of those phthalates into the drinking water. With that, like we have taken the food samples, and when we try to understand the estimated daily exposure of the food, we are seeing that the high fat containing food, especially the cottage cheese, showed in Delhi, it showed the maximum level of the daily intake, the high exposure, because of the high concentration we saw in cottage cheese. And the overall EDI was higher, therefore, for vegetarian adults over the non-vegetarians. And the estrogenic potential, what we saw in the bottled water, was pretty much high from the local brands. So that was one important information that we had, especially when we did the model work. Now, to understand the sources, we tried to track the compositional profile, and we ran a principal component analysis, a statistical analysis, and we saw that the first component was loaded with those high lipid-based or dairy products and water-based products. It was a combo of these two, and what we see is that like this kind of products, like maybe what we are suspecting that there can be the accumulation either from the agricultural practice to the soil, and there is a transmission from the contaminated water, especially the surface water or the groundwater, which is being used for the purpose, for the agricultural purpose. But the second component in the cottage cheese, which actually showed very high levels of phthalates, DHP, which was significantly different from all other samples, the DHP loading. And we see that there could be a possibility when we are processing the cottage cheese, or during more than the packaging material, the processing could be one reason. And for some of the packaging material, we also saw that this di-n-butyl phthalate could be one reason for this packaging material. What we are seeing in the package material, the amount of DNBP we are seeing is higher than which was non-packed, unpacked items, or which was not in a packaging material. So this is what important information we have. And the main take-home message is like, of course, the levels that we are seeing, although we are able to strategize different source types, and we can possibly control with the labeling or with the packaging type or during the processing time, but the levels are still not as high as reported in many other studies across the globe. So that's a good news for us. So with this, I must acknowledge Luca and Girija for keeping us on board, and which is why we have to acknowledge the project EDIFY. And I have to acknowledge both of them, like for being the partner, and also my research scholars who were involved in this project, Mr. Sarath Chandra and Mrs. Moitri Mukhopadhyay, who were there in this project throughout the entire phase. And I really thank everyone. And we have this paper. If you want, like, we can share it any point of time, and I'm open for any question. I hope some of the slides were visible. Thank you.
Thanks, Paramita. That was very, very interesting. And I'm sure the participants, the panelists really enjoyed. With this, I invite our next speaker, Dr. Mohan Sharma, research scientist at Resetox, Czech Republic. He's been working in this area with a strong focus on environmental pollution, human biomonitoring, and health risk assessment, and has worked on several multilateral projects assessing persistent organic pollutants, EDCs, and heavy metals. His major research interest is in investigating the fate and transport of environmental pollutants, their exposure to humans, and health implications. And I'm glad that I'm here to introduce my PhD student, Bridge has been my first student. Over to you, Bridge. Thank you so much. Bridge, you're on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Girija, for inviting me and for this wonderful opportunity. I distinctly remember participating in this summit as a student volunteer in 2011 at Delhi Taj Hotel. And today, after 1 decade, I'm among the invited speakers presenting my work to most influential stakeholders from different sectors and around the world. While growing up in India, I heard a very popular saying from my parents that "Jaisa khaoge ann, waisa rahega man," which literally means that your mind is what you eat. Unfortunately, today, we live in a world where safe food is a privilege. WHO estimates says that 1 in 10 people fall ill after eating contaminated food worldwide, which accounts for 600 million cases of foodborne diseases every year, accounting around 420,000 deaths, among which 30% are among children under 5 years of age. The bigger concern is that there exists a huge gap between developed and developing countries over the concern about food safety. In developing countries, in fact, 110 billion US dollars are lost every year in productivity and medical expenses resulting from the unsafe food consumption. The factors that lead to unsafe food in developing countries include use of unsafe water for cleaning and processing of the food, poor food production and food handling practices, example, inappropriate and excess use of chemicals in agriculture production, inadequate storage of food, inadequate and poorly enforced food safety and environmental regulations. Basically, we can categorize unsafe food into 3 categories: food contaminated by microorganisms that can cause foodborne illnesses, which are mostly temporary in nature and caused by bacteria, virus, parasites, fungi in the food. Then there is physically contaminated food, for example, the presence of hair, nails, pieces of glass, etc. in the food item. And lastly comes the chemically contaminated food containing toxic chemicals such as pesticides, herbicides, metals, microplastics, which can cause long-term health effects in humans. There have been several cases of chemical contamination in food around the globe. Some of the popular cases include Minamata mercury poisoning, in which people consumed mercury-containing fish from the Minamata Bay in 1960s. Another example is of Delhi, where cooking mustard oil was found chemically contaminated in 1998. And very popular episode of dioxin and PCB contamination in meat products in Europe during 90s in different countries, for example, Belgium, in Czech Republic, and in Germany. Well, some of the chemical contaminants in the food can be categorized as endocrine-disrupting chemicals. As their name suggests, these chemicals interfere with the natural functioning of endocrine system and lead to intergenerational health effects, including cognitive deficit, metabolic diseases and disorders, reproductive impairments, and various types of cancers. Today, there are around thousands of chemicals that are known or suspected to be EDCs. These chemicals are found in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, personal care products, including industrial chemicals, metals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc. Some of the popular examples of endocrine disruptive chemicals, as my colleague previously mentioned, are DDTs, PCBs, PBDs, bisphenol A, triclosan, parabens, lead, mercury, arsenic, cortisol, etc. Main exposure route to these EDCs is through diet, in addition to inhalation and direct contact to them. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now provide you the overview of EDCs in Indian food basket. What are their labels, dietary intakes, and a comparison with the European data, where food safety and chemical management regulations are the most advanced and comprehensive. This study was part of EDIFY project funded by the Norwegian Research Council. Results of this study have been published in the journal Environmental Pollution. Please read the article. It is freely accessible. As Luca and Dr. Paramita has clearly mentioned that we did our sample collection from Delhi and Dehradun, and what was the rationale for choosing these two study areas. We collected from these two study areas around 25 types of food items, including drinking water, fruits, vegetables, pulses, cereals, animal-based products. This includes winter and summer vegetables and fruits, and collection was done from wholesale markets, from supermarkets, and traditional street shops in peri-urban areas, that is in Dehradun. The samples were analyzed in Restox laboratories in the Czech Republic for the different organic pollutants. Restox labs are accredited for the analysis of several EDCs in food items and are world known for their precision. I will be focusing my further slides on these 6 categories of endocrine disrupting chemicals, OCPs, which includes DDT, hexachlorocyclohexane, HCV, and pentachlorobenzene, on 6 PCBs, 12 dioxin-like PCBs, 7 dioxins, 10 furans, and 10 polybrominated diphenyl ethers. In the next few slides, you will see several box and whisker plots depicting concentrations of different EDCs in different food items. On the x-axis of each graph, you will see the name of EDCs, and on the y-axis, the concentrations of EDCs. In this slide, there are 3 plots. In the top left corner is the plot depicting concentrations of different EDCs in municipal water and commercial water. On the top right side, the plot shows concentration of different EDCs in wheat and rice. And in the bottom, you see the plot which shows concentration of different EDCs in different vegetables. Clearly, you can see that the DDT and isomers of HCH, including linden, are the EDCs detected with the highest concentrations. In fact, this is not surprising, considering the history of Indian history of extensive consumption and use of DDT and linden in India for pest control and for vector-borne diseases control. In fact, DDT is still being consumed in India for controlling the spread of malaria. Similarly, in fruits and pulses, a large number of EDCs were detected, and the general trend of organochlorine pesticides being in high amount was consistent with other food items. Compared to plant-based food items, animal-based food items such as milk, yogurt, Indian cottage cheese, egg, chicken, meat, and fish had higher amount of EDCs. In fact, in chicken and egg and meat, we detected approximately 53 EDCs. For fish, we found that there is no difference in the fish from the local farms, local ponds, and from the supermarket. To see whether the EDC contamination in Indian food items has declined in the last 2 decades, we compared our results with the data from previously published studies on EDC food contamination in India during last 20 years. Interestingly, we found that there is no clear decline in concentrations of EDCs except for DDT and HCH in some of the food items such as fruits and vegetables. Another important part of this study was to compare EDC dietary exposure between the populations from urban and rural areas of India. As depicted on this slide, there are 2 types of plots, one which have white background and another which have gray background. The gray background plots, they represent dietary exposure of EDCs to rural population, and the one with the white background, they represent dietary exposure to urban population. And you can clearly see that the rural population is less exposed to EDCs through diet compared to the urban population. For example, in the case of OCPs, the dietary exposure of urban population is almost 5-fold higher than the dietary exposure of rural population to OCPs. Nevertheless, in both populations, children were the ones who were the most exposed to EDCs. We also compared our results with the comprehensive data from European studies. In this slide, you can see 2 panels, one with the light red background and another panel with the light green background. The panel with the light red background represents non-vegetarian populations from India and Europe, and the bottom panel with the light green background represents vegetarian and non-vegetarian vegetarian population from India and Europe. We found that the dietary exposure of PCBs, dioxin and dioxin-like PCBs was higher for the European population as compared to the Indian. The difference increased further in case of non-vegetarian populations. In the case of organochlorine pesticides and PBDs, there was no significant difference between the populations from Europe and India. One very clear message from this analysis was that diet also influenced the EDC exposure. Dietary pattern or dietary habits also influence the EDC exposure to a great extent. In conclusion, I would like to say that EDCs are omnipresent in Indian food basket. Considering that EDCs are highly toxic chemicals, their presence in the food basket means compromise with the health of millions of Indians, including the vulnerable population of pregnant women, their offspring, and growing children. We didn't see any clear evidence of the reduction in EDCs in Indian food items in the last 2 decades. This might be because of inadequate and unsystematic monitoring over the years, and also maybe because of the retrospective nature of chemical and environmental management regulations. With this, we urge in this study for a harmonized action from scientists, policymakers, and industrialists to tackle the challenge of EDCs and for our safe future. Thank you very much for your kind attention. This is it.
Thank you, Bridge. Thank you so much for a very detailed presentation. We are unfortunately not having much time, so I would just take a few questions here. We have a question from our chief guest, Dr. Roli Singh ma'am has mentioned that can Dr. Satish throw some light on the link between EDCs and circular economy and its implications? Satish ji.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. I think circular economy is all about how material chains are not wasted and they're brought back into supply chain process. And that's where it's important to understand how materials are brought back. And if you can assure the integrity of material without contaminants, otherwise you would be bringing back contaminants along with it. And it further complicates the whole supply chain. Even if you have a safe product or a product which is much safer, it'll have the possibility of contaminating it. I'll give you a small example why I'm saying this to you. There is a substance called, flame retardants, which are used in computers and all your plastics, which are, again, EDCs, or it's also a POP. So now when you recycle this plastic, which is your plastic, which is on your laptops or other things, and how it is done in India, it is not a safe process. Many of us understand that. It contaminates the whole plastic chain. Now that's the sad part of it, that even a plastic chain which was safe, which was sound, it contaminates it. So I'm just saying that one of it is just about recycling processes, but there could be many other things that you use in circular economy by extended life or by using it for different things. So you are likely to have a larger impact of toxicity in the material chain. So that is the link which I can say this way. Thank you.
Thank you. That answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions. I'll not be able to take all the questions, but nevertheless, some striking questions I thought I should pose it to the panel. Is there an alternative packing strategy for perishable food instead of plastics that you can recommend? Paramita, would you like to take this because you're also working on bioplastics?
Yeah, I think, a lot of people have come up with new kind of packaging material, which are, not as harmful as plastic. So all are not synthetic polymers made up of organic polymers. So yes, say made up from food waste. We are trying to make something out of the waste food. So even a lot of plant products, plant extracts, such packaging material would be, I think, will come in the market. Of course, we have to see the economics and the competitive part in terms of plastic packaging material. Yeah.
Thanks, Paramita, for that. Another question, this is to Dr. Teran from Dr. Luca. Would you like to briefly illustrate how in Europe risk assessment in the context of food safety, which is operated by EFSA, is distinct from risk management, which is operated by governmental authorities? I think this can be a model for consideration when comparing with the Indian context. Over to you, Dr. Teran.
Yes. Thank you for the question. Indeed, in the Europe, the European Food Safety Authority is completely separate from the European Commission. So basically, the risk assessment is provided by the European Food Safety Authority. The risk manager is provided by the European Commission. So basically, the system is thought to be completely independent and to maximize the transparency. And in this, the role of the European Food Safety Authority is to provide an advice. And the risk manager has the role to take a decision. So basically, to make a long process, as you can imagine, as simple as possible, is that a substance, which include also the assessment of the endocrine disrupting properties, is approved or not approved by the European Food Safety Authority. This means that this decision, approved or not approved, and also proposal for reference values, point of departure, consideration for replacement, are taken on board by the European Commission, but the authorization process is at country level. So the European Commission distributes at country level the authorization process. So it's up to the risk manager at the European Commission and the member state level to take on board or not take on board with different action the risk assessment as provided by the authority. Just to give you a brief example, a substance is considered based on the hazard cutoff criteria implemented by the guidance as an endocrine disruptor for T modalities. That is taken. The risk manager can decide that the substance will be out of the market, fully out of the market, or they can consider specific cases like negligible exposure. So they have to define what is a negligible exposure for this substance in order to minimize the risk for the citizen, or they can say under the Article 47 of the legislation that the substance can be used in specific cases because of its unicity. So that is an indication of complete separation of the two systems, risk assessment and risk manager.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This was very interesting answer. And then I know there is so much to learn from the EFSA model, and we are in the process of chemical management and safety rules. So there is a lot of scope for us to imbibe these models in our policy discourses. Thank you, everyone. And since we are not having so much of time, I'll not be able to take more questions, and apologies for that. However, we are here to answer questions. Our details are available. We could be contacted, and we'll be happy to answer any other queries by participants. I take this opportunity to just summarize what we have discussed today and how we can prevent the health impacts of EDCs, which really needs strategic plan to expand on the existing measures to address these problems. Some of the important actionable steps that we have come across are, I'll just say point-wise some of them: requirement of a risk analysis framework based on sources of EDCs and their impacts, such as risk mitigation measures, which can be adopted at source. Well, the next one is development of a collaborative platform between different ministries that can monitor or regulate chemical substances such as agriculture, fisheries, dairy, food processing, pharmaceutical, among others, to ascertain harmonized protocols, solutions to minimize exposure of EDCs. The next point: very few studies have been conducted in the presence of interlinkages of EDCs in food in India. It is imperative that Indian research institutions carry out advanced research on EDCs in order to generate robust data sets for strengthening the policy framework and regulatory mechanisms in this country. Point number 4, promotion of quality labeling systems for EDCs in food, which many of our speakers have already mentioned, which has been talked about in detail in the policy brief also, which just got released now. And strengthening of the regulatory framework by continuous updation based on global benchmarks. And the last point, strengthening of institutional capacity by infrastructure, technological and knowledge enhancement of concerned institutions. We could jointly make a huge difference. Thank you, everyone. And I would now request Vidhu to take the floor and propose a vote of thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Girija. On behalf of WSDS Secretariat at TERI, I thank all our distinguished speakers for their valuable time to discuss a pertinent topic. My special thanks to Srimati Roli Singh for bringing governmental perspective, Dr. Andrea Teron for sharing European perspective, and Dr. S K Sarkar for guiding the team on this important study. We would like to thank the Research Council of Norway and our partners, the Norwegian Institute of Water Research, Toxic Links, Munich Reketox, the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research, SRM Institute of Technology, Bharat Learn, and Mugama Consultants Private Limited. To all our panel speakers, I thank you for bringing forth first of its kind study on EDCs in India and hope that the study shall guide regulations and guidelines on EDCs in India. Most importantly, I thank all the participants for joining us today. Last but not the least, I would like to thank WSDS Secretariat and our platform organizers, Keystone, for providing all the necessary support for making this event a success. I welcome all our speakers and participants to join us at WSDS inaugural session to be held at 5:30 p.m. where Honorable Prime Minister shall be delivering the inaugural address. I thank you all once again.
Thank you.